Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our great series of Avasthas, which we are doing with Ryan from Asheville Vedic Astrology. Hello, welcome, Ryan, Tina.
Hi, everyone.
May we continue our journey of the Avasthas, and the last two ones gonna be Mercury and Venus, which we will touch upon today. And I give it straight away to you, Ryan, to start with Mercury.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you both again. So our last time we spoke, we did look at Saturn. We went into quite detail with Saturn, which I think is really important since there's a lot of misunderstanding about Saturn. But today, we're going to go ahead and take some time to look at Mercury, which is a good transition because of all the planets, the two planets that are actually friends to Saturn are Mercury and Venus. All right. So when we think about Mercury and we're considering the Avasthas, we need to think of two important points first and foremost. Number one, who are the friends to Mercury and who are the enemies to Mercury? And so when we think of Mercury, the two friends are the Sun and Venus, which means that whenever Mercury is going to be in the Sun sign in Leo or Venus's signs, or whenever Mercury is with Venus or Mercury is being aspected by the Sun, we're going to have Mercury being delighted, being supported. Whenever we have Mercury in the sign of the Moon or with the Moon, that Mercury is going to be starved or thirsted or agitated if the Moon happens to be in a waning state where it's considered to be a malefic planet. But what we see here is that Mercury only has one enemy, which overall tells us that most of the time, Mercury has the capacity to actually function well within the chart, as long as it's in good dignity, generally speaking. And this is important because Mercury is that aspect of ourself which allows us to make sense of the world. It allows us to organize our life, to manage our life, to communicate well. And when we think about it, when it comes to psychological issues, oftentimes we'll find afflictions to Mercury and the Moon. And the reason this is the case is because Mercury is our capacity to take in information from our senses. It essentially is our senses, right? And when people have psychological issues, they're not perceiving things clearly, or they're not perceiving things well. You know, when you get someone who's, say, a paranoid schizophrenic, for example, well, they're in a world, but the way their senses are telling them the world is showing up is not accurate, and so they respond in that way. When we have afflictions to the Moon, this is our emotional nature. And another thing that we see with psychological issues is inappropriate emotional responses. Okay, because the person might be in a situation and they respond with anger, they respond with anxiety or depression because of an affliction to the Moon, which might not be appropriate based on the reality of what's going on around them. So we have to pay a lot of attention to the Moon and Mercury, particularly when it comes to our psychological health and our psychological well-being. One is our emotional nature, the Moon. The other is our capacity to process the information that comes to us. Now, when we think about these Avasthas of Mercury, let's go ahead and start with the idea of the Moon starving Mercury, or the Moon negatively impacting Mercury, because that's where you're going to find most of the difficulty. Now,
because sorry to interrupt, because two of the main qualities of man or a person, let's say, intellect and emotions come together, so the overall view is sort of broken for clarity.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So perception is absolutely distorted or partly distorted.
Because, you know, when you think about these two planets, when they are aspecting each other, or when they're in the same sign, or when they switch signs, you have to really analyze both of them separately, because if someone does have difficulty functioning in the world, well, if it's Mercury having the problem, it's because they can't manage all the different aspects of their life, or they're not able to harmonize the input that comes in. Like, for example, many people who have an agitated Mercury, they're the kind of people that they can't take in they can't do multiple things at once, where you go and talk to them and they're trying to type an email or they're trying to do something else and they just cannot be distracted at all. Otherwise, they're not able to function. So when we look at Mercury, if it's starved by the moon or has some difficulty with the moon, there's too much of a confusion between the mind or the way things are organized and also one's sense of self, right? They can't separate the thoughts from the emotions. And that's where we go wrong, right? Where we're trying to interact in the world and we can't interact appropriately because our emotions are so caught up in how we think about things, or we can't feel comfortable because we have too many thoughts which are stimulating our emotions. So that's a real key to emotional health and well-being, is really learning to separate and use the moon and Mercury in their appropriate places, which is often hard to do when they're in a starved Avashta.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's think about moon and Mercury. So moon starving Mercury, and how's that going to look? Well, that's going to be when Mercury is in the sign of the moon, Cancer, when Mercury is with the moon, when Mercury is being aspected by the moon. And we do have to be very aware that while we can have pretty significant difficulties with Mercury when it comes to psychological problems, that overall, though, as I've mentioned before, these are not Avashtas such as Saturn starving Mars. These are not these real intense Avashtas where you get extremely damaged very quickly and you're just traumatized. These are what I would often consider to be a little subtler but more long-term problems, like when we have Mercury starved by the moon. Well, Mercury is a planet that deals with friendship, communication. The moon is a planet of the ego. So remember, as we discussed in our previous videos, anytime the moon aspects another planet, that's going to be how a person defines themselves. So when we have Mercury starved by the moon, the person is going to overly define themselves through their friendships. They're going to put way too much attention and too much demands on their friends, because if their friends aren't able to fulfill their needs, they're going to have almost like an emotional breakdown. So when Mercury is starved by the moon, we have to learn to be more detached and more non-judgmental, and we need to learn to allow our friends or the people that we relate to, whether it's friends or family members as well, we need to learn to mind our own business, essentially. So, for example, if we have Mercury and Moon, and let's say they're together in the 10th house, well, maybe a person has a lot of expectations that their family and friends are supposed to help them in their career, are supposed to support them, and essentially it's sometimes do the work for them. It's not always the case, but that can be a possibility. And so the person ends up not getting very far in their career, and they also end up ruining their friendships because their demands on their friends or their demands on their family is too high in regards to their capacity to help them in their work and their career. So this is why when we have Mercury starved by Moon, or thirsted or even agitated, we have to make sure that we have good boundaries between ourselves and our friends, and we have the capacity to let our friends live their own life and not think that we always have to be doing things together or defining ourselves by our friends. Does this make sense what I'm trying to share here about learning to have balance within friendships? Yeah. And again, this is why, even though this isn't one of the more aggressive avashtas, it is one that is often hard to share with a client, because when you've got Moon and Mercury influencing each other, they have a really deep-seated idea that they should define their life through their friendships and what their friends can do for them. And when you try to say things like, maybe you expect too much from your friends, maybe the reason you have difficulty achieving your goals in the house that these planets are situated is because you're putting too many demands on your friends. And it's hard for them to understand that, because in their mind, they're thinking, but that's the way it should be. Friends should do for friends. Do you see what I'm saying? How that can be difficult?
Yeah, entirely.
Yes. One question comes up here.
Yeah.
The moon is part of it. Moon is also defined as a mother. Mm-hmm. So the influence in such a native's life will be also there, probably. A big influence from mother's side, or
right.
her values, her
values, the way that she feels,
perception.
Right.
Yeah.
And it could be, things like, well, gee, you need to the mother could be saying things like, you need to get better friends, or why aren't your friends supporting you like they should? So you see, it can come in from this kind of early childhood upbringing from the mother, like you express here. So that's very good. And
so from there, this psychological issue starts coming into being, and then it is expressed further on.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And the point you bring up is very important, that you brought up the idea of mother. And at first I was focusing on mainly things like friends and communication. And we have to be very aware that when we think about these Avasthas, that we really need to think about everything that Mercury represents. So for example, I'm just going to give you a little list here. So for Mercury can represent communication, the skin, our ability to cognize, as I've discussed. Mercury can represent travel, discernment, games, relatives, craftsmanship, commerce, corporations, and learning. And then what that tells us is all those things, all those possibilities, when the moon is influencing Mercury, they have the potential to be negatively impacted. And what are they going to be negatively impacted by? Well, as you mentioned, they're going to be negatively impacted by lunar things, such as our sense of individuality, the blood, our inner satisfaction, the mother, popularity, dreams, how our bodies grow, and things of this nature. So when it comes down to the Lajjitaadi Avasthas, for these kinds of talks, we have to just pick a few things to talk about. But really, when you learn about what each planet represents, if you know a planet is starving another planet, well, anything that planet causing starvation represents could hurt or injure the planet that's getting starved. Okay. So, for example, when we think about things like Mercury ruling our capacity to do good research, our capacity to find the truth through research. Well, that's an individual who's got a great Mercury, and let's say that the doctor comes along and says, you've got this problem. They say, okay, well, I'm going to go research that. So they go home, they get on the internet, they find all their medical books, and they do such perfect research that they go back to their doctor and say, well, here's what the problem is. And the doctor says, that's it. Because the person has such a good Mercury that they're able to go through and find the truth through their own research. And discern. But if they've got that great Mercury and the moon is stronger, then what happens? The moon, the emotions are so caught up in that Mercury that they can't do good research because they're not detached enough to say, oh, here's this symptom, I don't have this symptom. Here's this symptom, I don't have this symptom. What they do is they say, do I really have this symptom? Oh, my mom had this problem. And they start getting so caught up in their emotions and worrying that they're not able to do good research. So that's another example of how Mercury, when it's being impacted by the moon, can cause a problem because the person cannot come to typically a valid conclusion based on the information that's presented to them because their emotions are too strongly influencing the outcome. So
perfect.
In this situation, the moon gets in the way of finding the truth. The moon wants to validate its own needs about why it feels upset. It doesn't necessarily want the bare bones data that Mercury can provide. They do cause a lot of problems for people. They're not necessarily, as I mentioned, the easiest ones to talk to a client about because, as you know, when you're talking to a client, they are really identified with what they think their chart says. And it could be that they go to one astrologer and the astrologer says, well, this is what your chart says. And they lock into it or they study it themselves and they say, this must be what it's about. And they go to another astrologer, which gives them a little bit different angle and vantage point. And it's possible that other astrologer might actually be more correct, but because they're so invested in the idea, the moon, the sense of individuality that the previous astrologer gave them, they cannot see the validity of maybe what the actual information might be. So this moon-Mercury combination is very hard to deal with when it comes to counseling a person because unless they've got some kind of very disciplined Saturn or great capacity for detachment, most of the time you're not going to be able to talk to them on a very logical level. But here's how I do it. here's how I do it. I do look at the chart and I try to figure out what seems to be the most unconscious karma that a person has, meaning that I could say to them, an apple is red, and they would say to me, "What are you talking about? The apple is green." I try to find that most unconscious kind of skewed thing, and then I try to figure out, well, first of all, are they asking me questions about that? Because if they're asking me questions about it, then I do feel that I have some responsibility to speak to it because they're asking me directly. So what I do is I say, all right, I'm going to describe this to you, and it's very likely that this won't make any sense to you. So I preface it by saying that this is what I see, but you need to ask yourself, is this true? Because it might not seem that way at first. And then I say, and then you need to ask maybe your friends or your family what they think about this. Because what often happens is then the friends and family say, well, of course, what that astrologer said, how can you not see that? I've been trying to tell you that for 20 years, right? Okay. So I try to address it by not defining them by it, by not locking them in and saying, this is the way it is. Because the second you do that, then they say, what are you talking about? You're a bad astrologer. I'm out of here.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Yeah, I couch it in such a way that they are able to think about it and then ask other people around them for other validation.
Yeah, that's true coaching. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and this really came into my awareness. I've used this example many, many, many times in my classes and maybe even on this series, but I realized early on in my career as an astrologer that people aren't always as, they don't really understand themselves as well as they think they do.
Sure.
What brought this up was when I looked at someone's chart and it was a woman, and I said, you must have some really abusive relationships in your life, really difficult relationships in your life where you're hurt or injured and these sorts of things, because she had a really difficult Mars in the 7th house and the 7th Lord was in the 6th house, like all the indications that would show spousal abuse. And she said, no, not at all. And I sort of looked at her for a minute. I thought to myself, because I was really just getting started, and I was like, well, maybe I've got the birth time wrong. Maybe I miscalculated. And that sat with me for a while. And then about 40 minutes into the conversation, she started telling me about how sometimes her husband flips out and will take like a shovel and like smash the window of her car in. And it's like she went into all these descriptions of things that were clearly not
abusive.
Quite abusive. Yeah, that's just normal because she came from a family where that was normal, where that's just the way people acted. So her level of abuse would have had to take it to a whole other level for me to say that accurately for her. Mm-hmm. So when I noticed that about people, because there are other things too, such as depression, I'd bring up, moon starving Saturn. I'd talk about depression and say, no, I don't have depression. And then they'd go on and the way they describe the world and the way they would, their way they saw the world clearly was someone who had some problems with depression. So anyway, point being, what I have learned early on is that as an astrologer, we have to really realize that not everyone has a very clear understanding of who they are. And this is what makes it so hard in the first place to even talk about, to teach techniques well. And this is why when I do astrology classes, when I do the astrology apprenticeship program, which is, 4-year program, I tell people, don't use your own chart. Do not use your own chart when you study. Do not use the chart of people that you love very dearly, that you're attached to, because what happens there is you're going to look at your chart and you're going to ignore the things that you don't want to be true. And then you're going to say that technique doesn't work. And then when you look at someone else's chart where it is true, you're not going to use it because you're going to have a psychological block, again, a very strong moon, Mercury issue, because you don't want to admit that it's true in your chart, so therefore you won't admit it's true in anyone else's chart. So I tell people, when you're studying astrology, do not use your own chart. Find the chart of someone that you can be utterly and completely detached about, that you don't care whether they live or they die, whether their arm falls off, whether they've got the best relationship in the world, that you just do not care one way or the other. Because when you do that, you're using the capacity to test techniques without allowing your moon and your emotions to get in the way of the research.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Or do you ladies have any thoughts on that?
Brilliantly spoken, Ryan.
Yes.
Because we can't be objective with our own things.
Yes, it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's extremely hard, and and so I tell people who want to learn, who want to apply for the apprenticeship program because they want to learn about their own chart. I say no. I'm like, you're not joining the apprenticeship program to learn about your own chart. I'm like, you're doing that if you want to learn to be an astrologer for other people. If you want to learn about your own chart, go just find an astrologer that you trust to help you work through it, because that's going to they're going to have more capacity to look at it clearly than you will over that 4-year period. It's not a very popular stance, but I think that it can be very helpful if people can start.
You certainly have a point there.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. When you all were learning astrology, I mean, I did the exact same thing. I would look at my chart.
Well,
I would say, sure, this Mars is doing great because Mars, he's wonderful, he's logical, and I'm logical and rational, and everything I do obviously makes sense, which is not true, which is why when I learned how my Mars actually worked, sometimes when I get a client that really frustrates me, I've learned that I have to type out my email and then have my wife look at it and say, is this appropriate to send? Because my Mars, of course, says it is, but it's not.
Very good.
Anyway, so let's move on. So Mercury and the Sun and Venus. Now, these can be really wonderful combinations because when we get the Sun delighting Mercury, so when the Sun is aspecting Mercury, or when Mercury is in Leo and it's strong in Leo, this is one of the best combinations because it allows that Mercury to have strong, loyal, committed friendships. It allows a person to have a really strong support group around them to help them achieve their goals and their inspirations in life. It allows a person to have very realistic and intelligent expectations around their friendships. When it comes to career, because we know that both Mercury and the Sun can be karakas of the 10th house, of our activity and our status in the world. When we get these two planets impacting each other in a positive fashion, this allows a person to excel within their career or any activity that they set themselves to, because the Sun is the inspiration. The Sun is the planet that looks at Mercury and says, here's the great thing that you can achieve by casting an aspect to that Mercury. And that Mercury then says, well, great, I'm supported by the king. I'm supported by my sense of inspiration, by my higher self. And with my Mercury now, I can organize my life in such a way that I can have good relationships with my business partners, good relationships with my friends. I can make choices intelligently, which are going to allow me to continue to grow and deepen my skillfulness in the world. So when we have Sun delighting Mercury, this is a wonderful, wonderful combination. It allows a person to find truth. It allows a person to recognize their own territory, meaning they're able to recognize, okay, I've got this strong suit, I've got these skills, and so if I want to achieve this, I can also find the other people to plug in here so I don't have to do it all myself. And so it builds a really strong network, a really strong community that the person can rely upon to achieve their goals in life. Because again, this idea of Mercury and Sun being karakas of the 10th house, that mutual support comes in there. Mercury being delighted by the Sun also gives a great sense of nobility and command over verbal expression. So that's why when you get Mercury in Leo, or when you get Mercury aspected by the Sun, when the person speaks, people listen. Number one, because they speak clearly. Number two, they speak with a sense of strength and inspiration. And they also help to uplift people to achieve their own inspiration. So even if the person's only speaking for themselves, their own personal needs, they'll do it in such a way that also inspires everyone else to recognize their own worth in committing to a project. So Mercury and Sun combinations can do very well, especially in the 2nd house, the 10th house, the 9th house, anywhere where there's going to be a sense of command and those natural Sun and Mercurial qualities are going to come out. Now,
you were mentioning now the the aspect or Mercury being in Leo. What's about the conjunction actually? Because Mercury can be combust.
Yeah, that's always a difficult one. And so, when I think about Mercury and the Sun in the same sign, because that's going to happen a lot, it's really going to depend upon the innate strengths of these planets and how close they are. So, for example, let me just pull up my example chart that I've got here, because I do have...
Great.
Yeah, so let me pull that up. Let's see. So, share screen, and we will use... Okay. So are you able to see this? Did this come up?
Yes, greatly.
So in this chart, it's good to make a segue here with this. In this chart, what we see is that we do have Mercury in the sign of the moon. So we do see there's going to be some problems there. But we also see that Mercury is with the sun. And anytime Mercury is in the same sign as the sun, it is going to experience some degree of agitation. And that's when we get the sun with any planet, essentially. So it's not just Mercury, it's the sun with any planet, which is why that is, in my experience, what the foundation of combustion is. So the foundation of combustion is based on, in my experience, this agitated avashta of the sun being in any sign with any planet. Now, what I do, since Mercury is always going to be pretty close to the sun in general, because the way it's situated in the solar system, it's never going to get more than, say, 30 degrees away from it, generally speaking. Might be a little bit more, I forget. So I have 30 or 60. I think it's just 30. It's the degree. So when I start getting Mercury within about 5 degrees of the sun, that's when I pay more attention to the difficult problems of that agitation hitting that Mercury. And as we'll see in this chart, we have Mercury within about 14 degrees of the sun. That's pretty far away. Am I doing that math right? 10, yeah, about 14 degrees away from the sun. So I'm not going to put too much of an emphasis on this Mercury getting excessively hurt by the sun here.
Yeah, that's out of combustion.
What's that?
That's out of combustion.
Right, I would say that's true. However, what we have to watch is, there is a particular yoga where anytime we get the sun and Mercury in the same sign, that it's going to give a lot of intelligence. Was that the Buddha yoga?
Yes.
So once I start getting this Mercury and this sun within about 5 degrees of each other, and really around 3, that's when I'm going to put more of an emphasis on that Mercury getting hurt or thirsted or starved by the sun. And when that happens, that's when we get really bad boundary issues. Mm. And that's when, for example, you'll meet people who, it's like you invite friends over to your house and maybe you have the rule, take off your shoes before you come inside, or leave your shoes at the door. And so this Mercury sun person, when it's really close, 3 to 4, even 5 degrees, they'll have that rule, but they'll think, but I don't want to upset my friends. So if the friends don't take off their shoes, they'll let them get away with it a few times. But each time, the person gets a little more agitated, a little more angry, a little more frustrated, until finally it's the 5th time, and the friend comes over and they don't take off their shoes, and they say, damn it, why don't you take off your shoes? You know that's my rule. Can't you see the sign on the door? And so what we see is that with these Mercury-Sun conjunctions, there's usually going to be an overstepping of boundaries, either by friends or authority figures, depending on the house that it's in. And the person needs to be very clear on their boundaries from the very beginning, meaning they can't wait until they're really aggravated about it. They have to state their boundaries and their goals in the very beginning, but they typically don't do that. Usually something occurs that makes them blow up a little bit later. So I think we might have taken that a little bit different direction than what you were asking. Did we speak to that, or is there more to your question that I missed?
No, that was actually a good example. I was asking for that because before you were speaking about the aspect or Mercury in the house of the sun. Mm-hmm. So now they come together and we talk about being broader apart from each other and actual combustion. And I think you have mentioned a good example for that.
Okay, good. Yeah, and in this example chart, let's just go ahead and segue into this chart because this gives a lot of good points to study. And what are those? Well, first of all, we're going to figure out what are the avashtas to this Mercury. And we see Mercury's here in Cancer. Mercury's here in Cancer. And we see that Mercury is with the sun. So it is going to have slight agitation, but it's pretty far away from the sun. So I'm not going to put a whole lot of attention to that. We see that this Mercury is with an exalted Jupiter, and a very good exalted Jupiter. This Jupiter is almost right at exaltation, 5 degrees 20.
Yes.
So this Mercury is going to be delighted by an exalted Jupiter. Now we also need to check the other things. And so when we look at this chart, when we just eyeball it, not looking at anything else, would you say that this Mercury is being seriously impacted by the moon just by looking at this chart? What is your first initial reaction?
Well, there will be some sort of aspect upon it, and it is into the sign of Cancer. So there will be of course, a moon's influence upon it. Yeah?
Yes, exactly. And that's very good. A lot of people, when they're looking for aspects, they're just looking for, is it directly across from the moon and so on. And oftentimes they miss, not always, but oftentimes they miss the fact that it's in the sign of the moon. That's very good. So yes, what we want to check here is how strong is this Mercury being thirsted by the moon? Because we know that Mercury's enemy is the moon. Well, first of all, we see that this moon is right in the middle of Sagittarius, which is a Yuva Avasthas, which means that is a very active karma. It's an adult state karma, and that's going to give the moon more power. And so, if we come over here to the Rashis-Avasthas screen, we're going to see that Mercury is getting starved by the moon to a negative 11.8. Now, again, how do we get this? It's going to be a combination of Shadbala, combination of Baladi and Jagardati Avasthas. But the way we get it is we see Mercury's Shadbala is going to be a total of 409.1 points. That's what this black number means right here, 409.1.
In that sense, could we say, just basically spoken, that this Mercury has a capacity to produce? Would we say like that too?
The Mercury itself, in order for it to have a capacity to produce, we need to look at the dignity, and we also need to look at the Shadbala of Mercury. So if we look at the dignity, we see that Mercury is in a great enemy sign first and foremost. So that's going to make it not be able to manage the affairs of its life that well. Okay, so being a great enemy sign, we start there. And what's it going to be in relationship to? Well, since it rules over the 9th house and it rules over the 12th house, that's going to show a lot of difficulty to relate well to their culture, to relate well to their marriage, to relate well to their spouse, and also to manage their expenses well. And we have some confluence there about marriage and spouse, because we also see that the Lord of the 7th house, Mars, is debilitated here in Cancer. So that's going to be an issue. We see that Mercury itself doesn't quite have enough Shadbala to manifest its qualities. It's got 0.9. It's got 97% essentially. It's close, but not quite.
Yes.
And then we take this moon, and that moon is taking this 409.1. It's subtracting a total of 420 points from that Mercury, which is putting Mercury into a deficiency. That's why Mercury then has the negative 11.8. So anytime this person goes through a moon-Mercury cycle or Mercury-moon cycle, or we get this Mercury negatively impacted by the moon or Saturn, for example, it's going to cause problems with their relationships, with their expenses, and with their marriage, and also with their career, 7, 8, 9, 10, because it's happening in the 10th house. So the general rule that we want to follow when it comes to house-lord combinations is that when we've got a planet in good dignity in a particular house, that whatever that planet rules over by its very nature, by being Mercury, but also what it rules over by its house, if it's in bad dignity, it's going to hurt that house. So in this example, Mercury rules the 9th and Mercury rules over the 12th. It's in the 10th house, which tells me that since this Mercury is in bad dignity, starved by the moon, in the 10th house, that that their marriage, that the way they see the world, the way they perceive their culture, the way they approach religion, the way they approach their belief systems, and also how they manage
expenditures,
their expenses, that's what drives their career, their capacity to do their work in the world into the ground. They just cannot get beyond that. And the moon causes them to have the problems because of an emotional imbalance. It's like they can't handle all the stress of business partners, of balancing their relationships, of managing their expenses. It causes them to have a nervous breakdown. And so that's why when we see a chart like this, we've got 4 planets in the 10th house, and it's a very mixed bag, because we've got an exalted Jupiter there, which helps out a lot. But we've also got a debilitated Mars, and we've got that Sun there, which is going to agitate all 3 of these planets. Now they're far away, so it's going to be a weaker agitation, but it's still going to agitate all three of these planets. And when I see charts like this, almost immediately what I've learned, especially when you get this kind of combination in the 10th house, is that the person has a real difficulty kind of doing anything of what they might consider to be of value in the world. Because number one, they're interested in too many different things. Number two, they don't have the emotional capacity to stay the course. And number three, since Jupiter is doing so well here, and it rules over their 3rd and their 6th house, that really what comes in is that they have too high of an expectation of things working out well by luck or by grace. And occasionally it works, occasionally it doesn't work. It's just not real stable when we have these kinds of combinations going on. So this is not an easy combination to have with Mercury, even though it's getting delighted by Jupiter. That allows the person to get picked up by their friends. That allows the person to have lucky breaks from time to time. But it's not enough to mitigate, these 4 planets in the 10th house, and that Mercury getting hit pretty good by that moon, bringing it down to negative 11.8. Does this bring up any questions or things we can tease out there? Because it is kind of complicated when you get that many planets together. Yes,
also it is happening into an emotional sign of Cancer, which is very changeable in nature.
Right.
So this will add to it as well, I believe, yeah?
Exactly. Like they want to take it easy, right? That's really, so look at this within the chart. Whenever we get Jupiter exalted from the 6th lord going into the 10th house, the sixth deals with our capacity to integrate well with our day-to-day activities, like just doing the normal humdrum things, like wake up, do email, drink your coffee, do a session, go check the mail, like the normal things that just happen every day. And when we get Jupiter exalted ruling the 6th in the 10th, oftentimes the person sort of expects things to just work out real easy, that they don't have to do the little things. And we can see this as well with Saturn and Rahu in the 2nd house to get some confluence here. Because whenever we get Saturn in the 2nd house, as we discussed in the Saturn video, the person is learning how to be responsible for their resources. And the Saturn isn't doing too well in that 2nd house, so it's showing a difficulty taking that responsibility in the first place. We see the Saturn's also falling in Scorpio, a very psychological, watery sign. So another indication of problems coming up because of psychological difficulties or difficulty mastering one's emotions or having discipline to overcome one's emotions. And we've got Rahu here in the 2nd house, which is another indication showing that in past lifetimes, they've not put a lot of attention to psychological balance because it's Scorpio, and they've not put a lot of attention to managing their resources well because it's in the 2nd house. So we have all this confluence here pointing towards that. And as we discussed with Mercury ruling the 12th, which is a house, it is of expenses, but we have to remember the 12th house also deals with things like luxury and retreats and kind of going on vacation. So this person kind of would rather be on vacation all the time. And when you talk to them about, well, how's your business going? How's your work going? They'll talk about, 4 different projects they want to do. It's like, yeah, but I'd really like to go to Costa Rica, or, I'm thinking of going down to Florida to spend some time on the beach. I'm like, well, have you taken care of, these business responsibilities, and how's your bank account doing? Because they do come to me and they're asking me these questions, and I keep drawing them back to the 2nd house about how they have to be more responsible and disciplined about 2nd house things where that Saturn and Rahu goes. And also, as we see with Mercury, about their expenses. And they just say, well, it just doesn't feel right. I'm trying to follow my bliss. And that's when I say, well, your bliss isn't leading you to financial responsibility, nor is it leading you to you taking care of your work very well, is it? And they say, yeah, well, I'm sure it'll come around. And it won't, So this is not an easy chart in that regard.
No. And Mercury in all Vargas is quite...
Exactly. Yeah, so here it's in great enemy, enemy. Great. I mean, the whole way through that Mercury is not doing
enemy
very well. So,
and he's also close to the center of that Rashi, so he's having 13 degrees. Yeah.
Right.
So it's also, as you call it, adult karma.
Mm-hmm.
Say. Yeah.
It's fully functional. It's that adult is in the room and it's doing what it needs to be doing, which is not that great because it's in a great enemy sign. But you know, we cannot ever forget Jupiter on an angle. Jupiter on an angle, because Jupiter not only is on an angle, but it's also exalted. So this is one of the reasons why this person is not destitute. This person is not really wanting for anything, because that Jupiter helps to take care of them. The problem all comes down to they're just not able to accomplish their goals, right? And at the end of the day, they're not freezing to death. They're not starving. They don't have any shortage of exploring their hobbies, but they also have not really accomplished a whole lot because there's too much interference there. So wonderful.
Is this a man or a woman? I wonder.
This is a man's chart, actually. Yeah, so he's a little too. Yeah. Anyway, but the other thing too is with the 7th house, when we have the 9th Lord Mercury in the 10th, and also the 7th Lord in the 10th, debilitated 7th Lord, bad dignity, 9th Lord, their spouse doesn't, they do have a spouse and they are married, but their spouse doesn't help them very much in that they don't really encourage them to take the right kind of responsibility. They sort of have the same kind of, "I'll just go with the flow" kind of a thing, and then they still never really accomplish anything. So it's kind of fascinating in that regard. But you know, that also brings us down to judgment. I mean, at the end of the day, does it really matter with this person? As I mentioned, they're able to be fed, they're able to be warm, they're able to not really want for anything. So only if I was looking at this chart in the sense of, you should be a contributing member to society, could I judge them. But in the grand scheme of things, I mean, they're an all right person and they're just fine. But anyway, I think you understand what I'm trying to get at there.
That will be the point which will frustrate that person sooner or later, more or less.
Right, exactly.
Yeah? So you give your hint.
Yes. And the same thing, you know, the hints that you give is, well, do you really want to accomplish anything of merit within this world? I mean, merit is in the sense of society saying that it's merit, because the 10th house, you know, the 10th house is the status that you get from what society says and so on. So, you know, we're not judging it on the case of just being a good person, which is probably more important than what society says. But when they keep coming to you and they keep asking, when am I going to have this? When is this all going to come together? I just say over and over, it's not going to come together until you get a handle on the Saturn, Rahu, until you get a handle on this emotional way to deal with your career. It's not going to get any better. And I don't say it in a judgmental way. I just simply say, it's just not going to do it until that happens. And I say, oh, well, okay, whatever. And that's that.
What to do the work.
Yeah. So anyway, well, yeah. One other thing I wanted to look at here before we move on to Venus. Where was it? Okay, so Mercury can benefit quite a lot from Saturn. It's not a particular Avasthas that you're going to get to Mercury from Saturn. It's not like a Lajjitaadi Avasthas. But when Saturn's working well, so for example, in this chart, if the Saturn would have been in good dignity, if the Saturn would have been closer to the middle of the sign, this Saturn would have been able to give the person to, in a sense, transcend their emotions. Meaning, they might say, yes, I'm upset or I'm in a bad mood, but they would still be able to go forward and do what needs to be done. So we never really want to discount a nice dignity, especially in an angle from Mercury or in a trine from Mercury, helping that Mercury to overcome any kind of emotional difficulties it might have due to that move. Not the case for this chart. I wanted to be clear about that.
Yes.
One other thing about Mercury is when he's getting hurt by Saturn. Let's discuss that for a moment, because this is one of the more difficult combinations, and that's going to be when we have Mercury in the same sign with Saturn. So it's not happening in this chart, but whenever we get Mercury and Saturn together, that starvation to Mercury, what's going to occur is that the person is never going to have enough information. So these are the kinds of clients that you get when they've gone to 12 other astrologers, and they think the next astrologer is going to give them just that bit of information which is going to put their mind to rest so they don't have to think about it anymore. But it never happens, because that Saturn, remember, he looks down, he always finds the problem. So you could go, the fifth astrologer you went to could have given you the best information in the world, but that Saturn comes in and says, yeah, but did he train with the right kind of guru? Did he really understand how this particular Avasthas work? How is he using his Ayanamshas? And so the person might get the good information, but they are so caught up in all the things that could go wrong that they don't trust the information, so they never get it. So when you see someone, or if you have Mercury, anyone who's listening, Mercury with Saturn, you have to be very conscious of the fact that you might have a tendency to never really accept good information because you think either the other person's always missing something, or there's just a piece of the puzzle left out that you just don't know about. Did you follow what I'm getting at with this?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
So
and I listen also, and I've seen in some places that this makes a good combination for a mathematician.
Yes, well, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there is good and bad in everything.
Mm-hmm. And the point you bring up about the mathematician, I'm sorry, did you have more? I don't want to interrupt.
No, that was it, basically.
Okay, so you're right. The great thing about the mathematician is that with mathematics, you can get to a final result that can be proven. Like, there's no question about this is the right answer. Because, again, I don't know that much about mathematics, but my sense is that when you have formulas, that you can have a formula and you can say, this is the right answer. You send it out to other physicists or chemists or mathematicians or whatever, and they can prove it as well. So that is why Mercury with Saturn, as you mentioned, can be very good for that, because they will pick at it and they will pick at it and they will pick at it and they will pick at it until they finally come to that final gem of truth. The problem comes when we have things that are more nebulous, like philosophical things or astrological things, where our system is not set up yet, like mathematics, to where you can come to a repeatable example every single time. There are way too many variables. So that's why it can be difficult for astrology, but not necessarily mathematics.
Definitely.
Or this is really difficult for people who are interested in philosophy, because those are the people who are going to go down the wormhole and they're going to drive themselves mad because they're never going to find the answer, because Mercury is the mind. Or Mercury is how we process information. When it comes to philosophy, there comes a point where the mind can't give you any more information. It just, that's that. So after you get to that, that's where yoga starts, because then you're moving beyond the mind and you're learning to function what you might call unconsciousness, or you're using the totality of yourself, and that cannot be expressed through Mercury, which is why when you get a seemingly enlightened person, people might not recognize them because they talk nonsense, because you cannot take that realization, put it into a word. You can teach a person how to get there through the mind, through Mercury, which is why, like in Vasishtha's yoga, they say things like, we use words, or we use Mercury to instruct the ignorant. But once you are not ignorant, we can't use words anymore. And then, of course, we get to that disconnect of, well, how do you know the difference? Well, again, you can't talk about it. So it's a difficult thing. So yeah, with that Mercury, you got to be very careful. And as an astrologer, if you are astrologers all and you're paying attention to this, you have to have a lot of patience with these people with Mercury-Saturn combinations, because they will drive you nuts if you take them too seriously. You have to be able to have detachment for yourself to say, look, I'm not going to be able to give you that final bit of information, which is going to finally make you believe that this is true. So you're going to have to learn to either trust and see what happens, or let it go, right? So there has to be this kind of detachment between the astrologer and the client, when you've got this kind of, when the client has this kind of combination, because you'll drive the astrologer. The astrologer will go mad if they keep taking the person too seriously in this regard.
Yeah, brilliant advice.
Yeah. So anyway, and this will happen through any house. So if you have, let me just give a little description of this, because I think that this might be the most important point for people to hear. If you get Mercury and Saturn in the second house, no matter what financial advisor you go to, you're always going to think that they're doing something a little bit wrong. and you're going to not quite believe in their ability. Mercury and Saturn in the third house. There's always going to be something about your friends which are going to let you down, and you're going to wish it was a little bit different. Mercury and Saturn in the fourth house. You're going to be let down by your parents, or you're always going to have this project that never gets fixed on your house that drives you mad. Fifth house, it'll happen with your children. You have expectations about what your children should do to be right. If they only had this one bit of information that only you can give them, then everything would work out. And it's never going to happen. Sixth house, it can be with enemies or it can be with health issues. When you get Mercury and Saturn in the sixth house, that is a hard one to counsel people about health and disease issues, because those are the people that have cabinets and cabinets and cabinets filled with every type of remedy, every type of herb, every type of drug, because they've tried everything and they always think the doctor or the practitioner has missed something. So you need to bring more Jupiter into it. Seventh house, it'll be problems with the spouse, communication with the spouse, or the spouse isn't always telling you the full story. You'll feel that way. Eighth house, it can deal with investments or inheritance issues. Ninth house, we can see it with our gurus, meaning no matter what guru we go to, we're always going to find something wrong with their information. Like they'll tell you 10 things that are actually accurate for you, but that 11th thing that they say that is wrong will make you negate every good thing that they've said. So Mercury and Saturn in the ninth is difficult in that regard. 10th house, it'll be about career. I just don't have the right information to make my career work. Or 11th house, social networks. 12th house will be about expenses. So with these Avasthas, when you know the quality of the Avastha, you just stick it in the house, and that's where that Avastha is going to play out, right? That's why when you see this Mercury Saturn combination, or any combination, you don't just want to say, oh, you're a very difficult person to get along with because, no matter what I tell you, it's not going to work. It's going to be specific to the house that it's in. Always remember that, specific to the house that it's in.